Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
When it comes to national security, would Britain be safer inside or outside the EU? Yesterday, the Work and Pension Secretary, Ian Duncan-Smith, claimed our membership of the EU made us more vulnerable to terrorism. Here's what he had to say.
And what we see with the European Union, its incapacity to get its act together, that leads to tensions. Who's to say in the next few years countries that have taken people from various areas aren't then going to give them kind of leave to remain and even passports, as we've seen in some cases, and then due course may well turn up again in the UK. So these are big issues further down the road for us, because this open border does not allow us to check and control people that may come and may spend time. We've seen what happened in Paris, where they spent ages planning and plotting, so who's to say it's not beyond the wit of man that those might already be thinking about that.
Ian Duncan-Smith there. Well, this morning the Defence Secretary Michael Fallon questioned that position and said we would be taking a big gamble with our security if we voted to leave the EU. Let's hear what he had to say.
No, it isn't true, and I don't think he actually quite said that. The position is we already have control of our own borders. We've opted out of all the open border arrangements in Europe. Russia invaded the Crimea, then they started to foment trouble in the eastern Ukraine. The only organisation that could deal with that wasn't NATO, which is the cornerstone of our defence, but was the European Union, which we were able to lead into applying sanctions against Russia, legally binding sanctions against trade with Russia, to ensure that Russia paid a price for that, learned that it can't behave like that, and can't ignore the West.
Michael Fallon there. Well, we're joined now by our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. Frank, how dangerous in your mind is it for either side to indulge in what some people are calling Project Fear and scaremongering over security issues?
I don't think it's dangerous. I just think it's incredibly unfair on the public, who deserve straight answers. Security is not something that should be politicised or obfuscated and confused and conflated with other issues like the economy or migration, etc. It stands on its own. Now, there are several different issues here. One is people. The other is arms. The reason why we haven't yet experienced, and I use the word yet there deliberately, the reason why we haven't yet experienced the kind of marauding terrorist firearms attack, as it's called, that Paris did twice last year, in January and then in November, the main reason is because it's much harder to get hold of powerful automatic weapons in this country. It's not impossible, and it may not always be that way, but we're protected by a coastline. So we don't have the open borders arrangement that continental Europe does. After the Paris attack in the Charlie Hebdo raid in January, I spoke to Gilles de Verhove, who's the coordinator of EU counterterrorism, and he told me that actually they've strengthened their external borders with the Balkans, where most of this stuff comes through from, hard weapons, big weapons. But once they're in continental Europe, it's very difficult to stop them. Britain does stop them. Now, that's unlikely to change if we're in or out of the EU. But if you look at counterterrorism in the European Union, it's actually not very good. The police and intelligence agencies don't share what they know. They keep it to themselves. In Britain, they do. So we've actually got a better apparatus here in this country. But Britain's closest arrangements in terms of intelligence and security cooperation, they're not with Europe. They're with the United States, and they're with what's called the Five Eyes countries. That's Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Those are the closest links, not with Europe.
So you're saying the issues of intelligence and our own geography, the fact that we're an island, to some extent better protect us against any potential future terrorist attack. But what about the issue of where the terrorists are coming from? Because much has been made, of course, about making links with migrants coming over from the Middle East, that there could be jihadis hidden there. There is, of course, the evidence that a lot of the attacks have been from homegrown terrorists here and on the continent.
I think it comes down to numbers. So, you know, if there were to be terrorists who hide themselves amongst the wave of migrants trying to get into Britain and other European countries, if there were to be ISIS members in there, their numbers are going to be very, very small indeed. But I suppose that the fear is that these could be highly trained people who spent time in Syria. But the fact remains that there are more than 2,000 people in this country already, UK citizens, UK residents, living and in some cases working here, who have sympathies with or connections to international terrorism. Some of them, or in fact nearly all of them, have committed no crime, but they've been detected by MI5 and Metropolitan Police as having those sympathies. So that isn't going to change whether we're in or out of the EU.
Okay.
That's a fact that's there already.
Frank Gardner, thank you very much. Well, joining me now to discuss this are Conservative MP Mark Pritchard. He's a former member of the National Security Strategy Committee and believes we are stronger in the EU. And Gerard Batten is a UKIP MEP, formerly his party's spokesman on security and defence. Welcome to both of you. Mark Pritchard, first of all, you're for Remain. Why were you one of the MPs who helped lead the so-called 81 rebellion, which called for an EU referendum? One might have expected you'd have been campaigning for out.
Well, the fact is the majority of people in this country have never had a say in the European issue. They weren't born in 1975, or they were born but weren't old enough to vote. And it was absolutely right that we should have a referendum, and I campaigned for that.
Right. And you think, from a security point of view, we're better in the EU? Why?
Absolutely. The fact is that this is a time for Europe to stand together rather than divide on the issues of security. But I have to say, I saw the comments earlier by Ian Duncan-Smith, who I've got a huge amount of respect for, great reforming welfare minister. But I think he's wrong to suggest that we have open borders. We're not part of the Schengen Agreement, as Michael Fallon has already said. And the Paris attacks, 8 of the majority, certainly 8 of them, were EU nationals. And in fact, the leader of the Paris attack was a Belgian national. And as Frank Gardner alluded to there, the attack in 7/7 in this country, 3 of them were British and 1 was German. So yes, we have to guard our borders from external threats, but we have a homegrown threat, and the government is taking action to deal with that. But I think it's absolutely wrong to suggest that we have open borders. We don't. And secondly, absolutely wrong to suggest, it's a very bold statement to suggest if the public vote to leave the European Union, that we will be safe from terrorism. I think that's a very, very bold statement to make. Can
anyone really make that sort of statement? Was Ian Duncan-Smith right or wrong to actually imply that we will be at more threat if we stay in the EU from terrorism?
Well, we're a growing threat, we know that, and it's not right to say that we don't have open borders, because although we're not in the Schengen area, all the Schengen areas is that there are no border checks within the Schengen area group of countries. But a European citizen wants to come to the EU, wants to come to the UK, then we have open borders. There's nothing we can do to stop that European citizen coming.
Right. No, not an EU citizen coming through, but we do have border checks, obviously, in France, don't we, at the moment?
Yes,
and those
we have
could be under threat if we pulled out of the EU.
Well, how can your border checks be at threat if you're actually an independent country? We had, if you come over on the Eurostar at the moment, you'll find very, very seldom is anybody checked as they come off the Eurostar. And of course, we had this problem of people getting on at Lille and bypassing the checks that go on at Brussels and Paris, for example. But if we control our borders, then we can put in what checks are appropriate for us.
Listening to Frank Gardner, he said the most important security arrangements are the bilateral agreements that we have with other countries, not necessarily our membership of the EU. So what do you say to that?
What I think Frank was also right to say is we have to be careful not to conflate the issue of asylum seekers and immigration and migration from within the European Union with the wider security issue. And the fact is, I think I've concluded over the period of the last few months, as somebody who sat on the committee you mentioned, previously on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, that our security is best served by, yes, our transatlantic relationship, but also being the counterbalance to France and Germany's domination of security policy, of foreign policy, of diplomacy. If we were to leave the European Union, this is really a question for Gerard, you know, if the British people vote to leave the European Union, do you agree that that would put France and Germany in a more dominant place in Europe?
Well, if you don't think France, particularly Germany, is in a dominant position now, then you should spend some more time in the European Parliament.
No, I'm not saying that. It's a pretty simple question. I'm saying, do you think that France and Germany would be more dominant if Britain leaves?
I don't see why the corollary of that is that Britain is somehow weaker for being an independent nation, which we were for 1,000 years before we joined the European Union.
But is it a counter? I think that's the question. Is Britain a counter to German and French dominance?
No, I think that it's very much a German project. The Germans pay the vast amount of the budget. They are the biggest contributors to the budget. And you've seen that Mrs. Merkel, by making one statement that nobody will be refused entry to Germany, has let in literally millions of migrants. And are we able to stop that? Did we have any influence on that?
Do you support
NATO? Of course I do,
right,
yeah.
OK, but do you agree that if the United Kingdom were to leave the European Union, that France and Germany would seek to build up European defence structures which would be in competition to NATO?
Well, I can tell you that what the European Union wants to do is to have one single seat in NATO, which is going to be the European Union, not the 28 individual seats.
Well, there we are. That's my point.
But that's their
one
intention.
of my points.
Do we really want to be part of that? Do we want to give up our seat on NATO in order to...
let's just pick up then on the question about, you said about Germany opening its doors to 1 million or so migrants. But Frank Gardner said again that actually the biggest threat is homegrown potential terrorists here, rather than an unknown quantity that may be smuggled in through a migrant wave.
Two of the people that blew themselves up in Paris in the sports stadium were there on forged Syrian passports. And I was reading an article this morning
but not
that
the majority were EU nationals.
The article which said Interpol knows of at least 250,000 fake passports in circulation, which has got to be the tip of an iceberg. And Greece and Italy are seen as industrial producers of faked passports in the European Union. So if somebody gets into the European Union on a fake passport or acquires one, we're powerless to actually stop them coming across our borders.
But I'm afraid you're not addressing the issue. You've made reference to 2 Syrian passports. I understood there was only 1 Syrian passport found at one of the scenes of the crime.
That was certainly the one that
the majority were EU nationals. So what would you do about the EU nationals?
We also talked about the...
He's not answering a single question.
You talked about the quality of our intelligence services, which I agree with. They're the ones that have actually done a terrific job here. If we knew things about European citizens which made us suspect that they could be involved in terrorism, under the current rules, we can't stop them coming into the country because they have right of entry.
But intelligence sharing will only come about. Intelligence sharing will only come about if we are full and active members of the European Union, and if we were to withdraw. Germany and France do not have to, under their own domestic legislation, share it with external agencies.
That's the final point. But thank you both very much.